Hey, what's up, guys, and welcome to Talk with Tubbs, a petrolhead's perspective. As always, I'm your host, Tapelo, aka Tubbs, and I'm going to talk you through this podcast that deals with everything motoring. We're going to talk what's new on the market, what's old on the market, what's good on the market, and also what's bad on the market. Then we're also going to delve into some motorsport, but more focused on my favorite form of motorsport, Formula One. We're going to talk driver lineups, what we feel, react, but most of all, I'm trying to give you a petrolhead's perspective. Words that come from someone who's as passionate about the industry as anyone I know. So as ever, let me not waste your time. Here we go. Talk with Tubbs is a go. Right, and I'm back. Look, it's been a while. I will admit that. But the reason for that is I've had a lot of changes on my side, and some days it's very difficult to be doing this. Sometimes I have time, sometimes I don't have time. But while I was away, I found that I actually missed this. I actually missed speaking about Formula One, because what it did for me was it just allowed me the opportunity to enjoy the sport differently. And what I mean by that is, yes, there is... I don't know if you'll catch this on the mic, but there's just something revving outside, and just by the sound of it, I'm gonna go something with the 6-cylinder engine. But yeah, I digress. What it did for me, there's enjoyment to be gained from watching Formula One, and just that's it. There's enjoyment to be gained from watching Formula One as a sport, right? And there's enjoyment to be gained from immersing yourself into the sport, following certain personalities within the sport, interacting with people who enjoy the sport with you and all that type of stuff. But there's a different level of enjoyment in doing this. Watching the races with the idea that you're analyzing as you're watching. It's very easy to watch any sport, really. Football, rugby, Formula One. It's very easy to watch the sport with the idea that, look, I'm just watching and it's going to end and that's whatever. But there's a fundamental difference when you're watching it to analyze and try and make sense of what's happening. So I missed that. And the podcast gave me that, because I had to watch to understand and to convey what was happening to you, the listener of this. And in a way, it helps me as well, because I never want to be in a situation where I'm talking about something that I don't fundamentally have some sort of understanding about, and some sort of, dare I say, passion about. When you talk about something that you're not passionate about, it's very easy to be vague and lack that killer edge, that the thing that conveys the message more effectively to your listener. So yeah, look, I've been away, and while I've been away, there's a lot that's been happening in Formula One. It's so many things needed to be touched on. And look, I'll just be regurgitating what other people have said at this point, and I really didn't want it to be like that, but there were so many racist incidents, abuse of fans at tracks in Austria, like so many things. The former Red Aston Martin employee who came out spoke about his experiences with racism and prejudice in the Aston Martin team. It's all those things needed to be touched on. And unfortunately, I was away at the time. Yes, while I did try and keep tabs on what was happening, I'm going to weigh this podcast down. And trust me, it's a frustrating thing, because those things are not topics that we'd still like to be having in this day and age. Look, we all say people should move past this. We all think it's over, but it's really not. Depending on where you find yourself, it can be a lonely existence. It can be difficult. And I think social media is helping those who didn't have a voice, finally giving them a voice. And I really hope, I don't know how, I don't know when, but I really hope there is a turning point for the sport, and we can move past instances like this where people feel safe, people feel happy, people feel comfortable with just being themselves, expressing their love for a team, a driver, just being themselves in every situation. And that doesn't open up the floor for ridicule, for racism, for prejudice, and all that type of jazz. It really sucks when you have to wake up in the morning and one of the first things about your favorite sport is exactly that. It's instances of racism, instances of prejudice, homophobia, abuse, torment. That's not what you want to read. And I think Formula One, they've been given such a platform because of the growth of the sport, but now they need to act on these things. Actions need to be effective. They need to be effective and they need to be transparent in how they deal with all these things. So yeah, I don't want to get too much into that. I just thought I'd give you a little bit of what I feel about what's happening. So what I'm going to do, and this is the important part, this is just going to be my chat around the French Grand Prix. I'm literally recording this less than an hour after the race. So everything is still fresh. I actually feel kind of tired today, and I think that's because my adrenaline was high. Now I'm kind of on a low. But yeah, I'm recording this just after the race, and everything is fresh. And I'm just gonna go through it and maybe give a few predictions on what's gonna happen next week at the Hungarian Grand Prix. So this season is proving quite interesting because the rules have given us something they said they would. They did, kind of mention closer racing, how it's going to be more effective to follow. And what we're seeing is that, yes, the cars have gone up in weight. The cars do appear to be more sluggish in the slow stuff. So they were suffering a lot in street circuits, your Monacos and all that type of stuff. But in the more purpose-built racetracks, your Silverstones, tracks like that, the rules are achieving what they set out to do, and the racing has been very interesting. And I think every season when there's some sort of change or some sort of alteration to the aero rules, what we look for are the races that tend to be boring. And that's what the French Grand Prix is. So coming into this weekend, it was all about how will these rules impact the racing? Will the racing be more interesting? Will the racing be more boring? Sorry about that. Yeah, but I'm trying to give you context before I get into the race, just to get a mindset of why we talk the way we do about these races. So coming into this race, we kind of wanted to see what was going to happen. But now the interesting part is because of the current heat wave that's going around in Europe, track conditions were extremely hot. I think just before the race today, the temperatures were 30, 31, 32 ambient and 60 track temperature. Now that is extremely high for a track that we've known to have high tire degradation. And we've seen in previous races last year as well, how going on an alternate strategy because of the tire degradation can be a good thing. So that's an aspect of today's race. Well, you'll be listening to this on Monday. So yesterday's race, that was an aspect that I was very interested in seeing how it was going to pan out. The moment we started seeing, the track conditions evolved extremely hot. I think so hot that we actually saw some of the drivers wearing the cooling vest that has ice and stuff. We generally see that in the really hot races like Singapore when it's really hot, but I think it was the first time in recent memory that I've seen that at the French Grand Prix. So we knew that heat and tire deg was going to be a factor in the race, a factor. And with that came the realization that Red Bull have tended to struggle when it comes to tire degradation. And I think we saw this previously. The name of the race just got away. I think it was in Baku where we saw this, I think with Checo. And there was another race, in Austria, yes. In Austria, where Max also struggled with tire deg. So I thought that would be an interesting comparison between Red Bull and Ferrari. We're going to focus on them because they are the top two teams at the moment. So qualifying was interesting. Red Bull had such a huge advantage in Sector 2, which is mainly comprised of the long straight. Their straight line advantage is something to be envied by other teams. Look, every team has its strengths, every team has its weaknesses. Straight line is definitely a Red Bull thing at the moment. Yes, Ferrari looked fantastic in the last sector. The balance of the car, the aero efficiency and the way the car was able to attack the long corners. This is going to take me back to an issue I had with Formula One broadcasting this year, and I said this before in the season, that oftentimes, especially in the free practice sessions, what would happen last year is if we had a correspondent live on track, when they were talking about the way cars were taking corners, we'd switch to them and actually see the cars go through the corners. I think one of the best examples of this was in Zandvoort last year, the Dutch Grand Prix, especially turn 3, because it's such a banked corner. A lot of the talk was how the different drivers were taking different lines. And then fast forward to the French Grand Prix this year, that happened again during free practice. There was a lot of emphasis on how the Ferraris were taking a different line through the long corners. They were taking a different line because they were so more confident. They were turning in later so that they could brake later, etc., etc. But we never got to see that in practice, simply because the focus was elsewhere. And I think that's something that's been missing from the direction this year, because it is so crucial to see how different drivers, different cars behave in those sectors, just to see how different teams are making up their time. Ferrari had a positive advantage, a definitively clear advantage over Red Bull in the third sector. But it would have been interesting to see how the cars went about it. Yes, you can talk about finding your own onboards, etc., etc. But from a broadcasting perspective, you need to put that information, especially if you're going to have one of your commentators live on track and talking about it. So yeah, that's it. Now let's get into the race. Now, again, tire deg was assumed to be high, temperatures were high, and then I saw this just before the race, that the pit lane was extended. This being one of the slower pit lanes on the grid, 60 kilometer limit instead of the usual 80. And a predicted time was around 26, 27 seconds. Now that's a long time. And in a race where we're predicting high tire degradation, that becomes a critical strategy factor, because the number of pit stops you take, coupled with the long or the high time loss, that's something you need to factor in. And this is where I initially thought, listen, there's no way they're going to do one-stop races. I'm calling it 2, maybe 3 from some teams. I joked about it over social media, over WhatsApp with friends, that, listen, we might possibly see 4 stops from some teams. But yeah, seems like a one-stop was possible. Some teams did a one-stop, but it required some conservation of the tire life. And you could see that in the way that you would have a peak in lap time, sometime about a 10, say 5 to 7 fast laps, or generally fast laps, and then a kind of slow down to conserve tire life and kind of wait it out. And with the way the track is set up, it's not a track where you predict to have a lot of safety cars. Come in, Charles Leclerc. Look, we need to talk about Ferrari. They've been disappointing this year. Disappointing not because of their car. Their car has been brilliant in terms of pace, atrocious in terms of reliability. They've lost a lot of points this season through DNFs, and it's become a joke at this point that every race we're now expecting a Ferrari DNF, whether that be Sainz or whether that be Leclerc. We're kind of waiting for it, right? And obviously, Sainz had taken the engine penalty. He was going to start way back. They decided to add more elements. So he's starting from the back. But with Charles, that was a big fear. You weren't really afraid of other things. His performance was decent, but you were kind of afraid of the reliability. And as I'm recording this, there's no confirmation on what caused his crash. It looked like he just lost the rear, something akin to what Hamilton and Russell went through in Austria. But there were rumors, and I heard this on commentary as well, that it could be a stuck throttle. Now, going back to Austria, this is a problem that Charles Leclerc had, where you apply the throttle, you open the throttle, and as you lift off to start braking, the throttle didn't fully disengage, so it was still applied. And the rumors were that's what happened today. That's what caused the crash. And if that's the case, it would make sense. You're trying to brake into a long corner and you still have throttle applied. It's very easy to lose the rear because you're not balancing it the way you want to. If that's the case, then it's a massively, massively, massively unfortunate thing for Charles. And he was, at the moment, dare I say, comfortable in the lead. And this is something that Ferrari has to look into if it is even suspected, even if it's not the thing. But the fact that it's a suspicion that this could have happened again, it's fine to ignore because it's the last 20%, the throttle is 20% engaged. But what happens when you're going into a fast corner and the throttle doesn't fully disengage or it stays fully applied? That's a really dangerous situation, and that's not something you can afford. So that's something they really need to look into. That's really dangerous. So yeah, Charles Leclerc crashes out. And I think this was, again, the crashing out of Charles Leclerc gave us an interesting race because it added a safety car, cheap pit stops or something. Finally, the Merc boys, well, let me say Hamilton gets lucky with a pit stop caused by a safety car. Yes, the pit stops were slow, but we'll get to that, right? So Charles, the one thing I said, it gave us an interesting race in that sense that we got the cheap pit stops, but it took away some entertainment because I would have liked to see how the race developed between Max and Charles Leclerc. There was a point in the race where you felt like both the drivers were maximizing on the strength of the cars. Max was catching up in Sector 2 because of the straight line advantage, but Charles was catching up, was pulling away in Sector 3 because of the stable aero platform that they have. So it would have been interesting to see how those two concepts manifested throughout the race. Moving on from that, Carlos Sainz was starting in the back. His main aim was to try and get as far up as possible. Now, this is where it gets difficult to put into words because we don't have the telemetry that teams have. So we're usually judging the strategy of teams based on what we're seeing on live broadcast. And I will preface this little bit of chat with that. If Ferrari was seeing that Sainz was he wouldn't be able to finish the race on that set of mediums, fair enough, call him into a pit stop. But then if you're going to do that, be decisive with it. Why are they telling him to pit in Sector 3 when he's going for an overtake? That's not the kind of radio. Actually, in that type of situation, you don't want to hear any radio message from your team. So to get one that's telling you to pit when you're going for an overtake that's literally near the entrance of the pit lane, I can understand why Carlos Sainz ignored it and went on for an extra lap. One of the big issues with Ferrari this year, apart from the reliability, has been the way they fluff up their strategy. And none a big example than what we saw in Monaco. But Formula One, we tend to focus on Formula One as a thing with the cars. Build a fast car, have a good driver, and that's it. But the bigger aspect, let me not say bigger, but somewhat equitable aspect is the strategy game. How are you making the strategy work for you? And it's calls like that, the indecisions, the indecisiveness of the team, and dare I say, the lack of foresight or the lack of perception of what's happening on track. Yes, today it might not have been the worst thing, the consequence might not have been that great, but that is not something you want to continue with week in, week out. And I think that's a problem that Ferrari needs to get into. As we're talking now, Ferrari they've given the title to Red Bull. Yes, they have a fast car that could challenge Red Bull on a lot of tracks, but their strategy and reliability is essentially given Max the opportunity to run away with the title because they are the closest challengers. And look, if it's one or the other, you can understand. Well, you won't understand, but it's something you can work on, right? You can work on it. If your strategy is poor, at least you have a reliable car and you can work on that. If your reliability is poor, then at least have the strategy go right in races where you can make a difference. But if your car's unreliable and your strategy is not working, then you're losing points at each and every single race. I think the stats right now, let me try and pull out the points table currently, because I was surprised when I saw the current point standings, particularly the difference between Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc. The difference between Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc is 7 points. Right, let's do this. Max is 63 points ahead of Charles Leclerc, and I don't see Charles catching up to Max. Sergio is 7 points behind Charles Leclerc. That's crazy. George Russell is a point behind Carlos Sainz. Now, judging by how slow Mercedes have been this season, that is an astounding points difference that George Russell is a point behind Carlos Sainz. So when we continuously say that Ferrari have given the title away to Red Bull, this is what we're talking about, right? Spoken enough about Ferrari. Disappointment. Red Bull. Look, I said this last year, no matter the emotions of last year, and I've said this before, I've said this all throughout high school, my early university days, and I'll still say this now. Max Verstappen is one talented driver. No, look, I might have my problems with him in terms of attitude, but from a driving perspective, he's one of the best on the grid. And when he has a car that suits his style, or when he has, doesn't necessarily even have to be a car that suits his style, but when he has a car that he can manipulate to do what he needed to do, he's borderline unbeatable. He's up there with some of the best that we have on the grid right now. And we saw that last year with him and the races where he was driving that R16B to amazing levels of consistency. And we're seeing that again this year. When the car is reliable and the car is doing what he needs it to do, it takes a special kind of effort to stop him, and Ferrari just don't have that right now. Sergio Perez, on the other hand, he fluctuates a lot. And this is not something I thought we'd be saying about Checo, right? Excuse me. It's not something that I thought we'd be saying a lot about Checo. He fluctuates. Some races he's really good and he's close to Max, and then some races he's generally nowhere. And this weekend was one of the ones where he was nowhere. He has had a considerable difference in lap time to Max. We saw that throughout practice, throughout qualifying, and throughout the race. And because of that, that allowed the two Mercedes to jump him in the race. And to talk about Mercedes now, my team is frustrating. Look, I've made no secret of it. I am slightly biased. I am a Mercedes fan. I'm a massive Lewis Hamilton fan. But my team is frustrating. And I think I've reached a point where I'm calling this year a bust. Look, Mercedes are close enough to Ferrari in terms of the constructors to possibly finish in second. I don't think that they have no chance of catching Red Bull, no chance. But they're only, 44 points behind Ferrari with about half the season to go, and with Ferrari proving to be unreliable and Mercedes being the most reliable team on the grid, that's a possible deficit that they can close up as the season goes by. Lewis Hamilton was brilliant. And again, how many races have we had this season? That was the 12th race, right? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 12 races we've had this season, and with Mercedes being considerably slower than the front two teams, in the 12 races they've had, oh man, how many podiums is it? I think 9 or 10 podiums combined as a team. That's an impressive achievement when you're underperforming. And I think sometimes this is one of the things that people will troll us Mercedes fans for, but even in bad performances, Mercedes are still able to pick up points. And they're comfortably ahead of McLaren. It's Alpine now. Alpine in 4th place in terms of the constructors. So Mercedes are really now fighting Ferrari in the constructors. They don't need to worry about who's behind them. And Lewis Hamilton and George Russell are, dare I say, proving to be one of the best team pairings on the grid. Yes, other team pairings are consistent, and there are special mentions that can go out to the driver pairing. For example, at Alpine, they've been decent. I will give some praise as well to Alfa Romeo. They have a good pairing. Not as good, but worthy of praise as well. But Lewis Hamilton and George Russell have this ability. If you're a fan of them, you'll love it. If you're an opponent, you'll hate it, of being there or thereabouts. And that's what you have to do when you're in a slower car. You have to be there or thereabouts and let the race come to you. And that's what they've been doing so brilliantly so far this season. And Lewis Hamilton's podium today, and Lewis Hamilton and George Russell's podium, both of their podiums today were earned, thoroughly earned. You cannot talk about some luck. Yes, Charles Leclerc crashed out, but he crashed out in a situation where Lewis Hamilton was already ahead of Sergio Perez. He jumped him at the start and he stayed ahead throughout the whole race. Even when Sergio got close, Hamilton had the capacity to pull away. And George was putting pressure all the time. So they put themselves in situations where they could capitalize on whatever happens, and this was earned through merit. And that's brilliant to see from a team that we know are still struggling to understand their car. Like I said, I think this year's a bust. It's either to fight Ferrari for second in the Constructors and go and mount a challenge next year. But that's it. Like, I thought this race would be more interesting for strategy. But yeah, there were strategic blunders, there were strategic luck. Again, finally Mercedes get it right, safety car with Lewis Hamilton, and a double stack. Yes, admittedly the pit stops were slow. I think Hamilton got a 3.8, George Russell got a 4.1. That's slow, but we've been complaining about Mercedes pit stops for a while now. But I think that's it. Sometimes you need races to go like this. Sometimes you need races where it wasn't the best race, but it wasn't a boring race either. It was one of those where you're like, it's good. It gets a solid score, and that's what we needed to see. Now, going into next race, and I focused on the top three teams. McLaren put in a decent showing. They've got upgrades on their car, and they had somewhat a positive showing, actually. A positive showing for that car that we know has been slow and tough to get around sometimes. So today, their showing was decent. Norris finished in 7th and Ricciardo in 9th. He was close to Norris for majority of the time, and it's a very bad situation there with Danny Rick. Alpine, again, like I said, they're a driver pairing that deserves some praise. They're very solid. Alonso and Ocon, they finished Alonso 6th, Ocon 8th. Very solid pairing, and sometimes that's what they need to do. They need to be boring but scoring. Just get the points consistently. And that's why they're doing, and that's why they're above McLaren. Yes, sometimes they are underperforming, but they've been good. 10th and 11th are the Aston Martin boys, Lance Stroll and Sebastian Vettel. Look, this is one team I really don't understand what they're doing at this. We thought when there was the whole brouhaha over them possibly copying Red Bull's side pod design, that they might be quick. You know, their upgrades resulted in a fundamentally different car, but they're no way. This is actually a good performance from them. You know, Stroll in 10th, Vettel in 11th. Considering where they were during qualifying, that was actually very decent. Pierre Gasly in 12th, Yuki Tsunoda DNF. He did have contact, I think it was the first lap of the race, and that resulted in damage. So when there was a safety car, he retired the car. But Pierre Gasly, it's yeah, Pierre's tough, man. After the highs of last year, you'd expect Pierre to be finishing way higher this year, but I think a lot of that is down to the car. But I think even Pierre has taken some sort of knock on his confidence, because Yuki Tsunoda is really close to Pierre, and in certain races he is performing significantly better than him. 13th was Albon. A good return to Formula One from Albon. He's had some good performances, and I think one of them was Australia, but he's been solid, and again, he's outpacing his teammate, which is generally your first rival in Formula One. You're always judged against your teammate. Granted, your teammate is Nicholas Latifi, but right. 14 Bottas, 15 Mick Schumacher. Up and down race with Schumacher. Some incidents on track, wasn't his best. Guan Yu Zhou in 16th. I think he had an incident as well, had to change the front wing. So yeah, Latifi, Magnussen, Leclerc, Tsunoda, all DNFs, right? But yeah, look, overall it was a good race. I'm happy. I'm happy. I think you can tell. I'm a little bit tired, but I am happy. Mercedes did me really proud. I think that was the best cumulative performance from Mercedes this season, right? That was brilliant. Going to Hungary. And this is the tough thing this season. You can make predictions and sometimes they don't work. But just on the merit of each team and their car, that seems to be a race that's strongly going to favor Ferrari. Ferrari, with the higher downforce car, suits a track like Hungary. We said the same thing about Monaco, and then they messed it up with strategy, and that ultimately cost them the win. So we'll see how that goes. Red Bull, I think, look, Red Bull are still competitive. Even when we're talking about a track where Ferrari will be the favorites, Red Bull are still competitive enough to put pressure on them, and a strategic mishap or a driver error, Red Bull will be in there, especially with Max behind the wheel. So that's still another interesting conversation. Mercedes, look, it's no secret they've gotten closer to the front two teams. And the biggest issue with Mercedes now, whether it's something they can solve or they're going to carry over for the rest of the season, is they're really slow over one lap, but have excellent subjectively. Obviously they're not challenging for wins, but from where they are, they've got good race pace. And I think that's the weird thing with Mercedes. This season so far, when it comes to Mercedes, I don't focus too much on qualifying. As long as they qualify, in the top six, it's more about their race pace. Is this a good strategy going forward? No, but it's the best strategy they have at the moment. So, yeah, look, I'm looking forward to an interesting race next week. Obviously, it's a difficult track to overtake around, but we'll see. Look, these regulations have shown that the cars can follow, so we might be in for a race with a few overtakes. But yeah, so look, man, this has been a good week to come back. I enjoyed the race. I'm enjoying this again. I'm gonna try and make this more regular. If I have time, I'll try and make time. It's funny, when I don't have time for these podcasts, I'm still watching the races, right? I'm not gonna miss Formula One, but it's all the other stuff around Formula One that I tend to struggle making time for. But I will try and keep these podcasts relevant and up to date. Yes, I know from my break there's a lot of things I didn't touch on, but listen, unfortunately, it is what it is. But yeah, I'm trying to keep these short. There is a few things I have planned for this podcast, going forward before the end of the season. You might see maybe after the break, we'll come back with some new things. But for now, just bear with me. I'm trying to make this as enjoyable for you and for me as well. Glad for all the support on social media. The engagement is relatively enjoyable. You do get the few fuck yous and all that from different people, but look, it's been great. It's good being back. Oh yeah, kudos again to Lewis Hamilton on his 300th Formula One race to get a podium second, and that is his 187th podium, which equates to about 62.3% podium finishes in his Formula One career. That's legendary stuff. So yeah, thank you so much. This has been Tapelo from Talk with Tubbs. This was fun. Let's do it again next week. I will probably try and touch on some motoring news during the week. There are some things I want to talk about, but overall, Formula One is still good. Formula One has issues they need to sort out. People need to sort themselves out. Let's just be nice to each other. Treat each other with respect. We all enjoy the sport. Let's just help each other enjoy it a tad more. As always, see you next week.